It's always really special to me when we can present a program for you with one of our own, because Springfield has a lot of experts here. And tonight, not only do we have one of our own, but we have two of our own. So you're in for a treat. I'd first like to introduce Dr. Roy Worley. Roy is one of our beloved WACI members. Roy, we honored previously for his really tireless work and dedication to the WACI mission. He's one of our founding members, and we just so value his work with WACI over the years. So thank you again, Roy, for that. Roy, besides founding WACI here, had a long role and career in economics and public affairs. He earned his undergraduate degree at Washington University in St. Louis, where he was also a member of the ROTC. Roy served in the military as a second lieutenant. He then went on to earn his PhD in economics from Yale University. And then he joined the Department of State. He worked with Presidents Johnson and Kennedy and served on President Kenzie's Council of Economic Advisors and served in a bunch of places, including Laos and Vietnam. In the early 1970s, he came to Springfield to join the faculty of a brand new university, Sangamon State University, now UIS Springfield. He has been active in international affairs, and the reason we have such a vibrant council today is in large part to Roy. So thank you, Roy. And our second distinguished speaker tonight is Dr. Christopher McDonald. Dr. McDonald grew up in the United Kingdom, and he read politics and international relations at Lancaster University before coming to the United States for graduate work and earned his doctorate in political science from the University of Georgia in Athens. Dr. McDonald has taught at Lincoln Land since 1998, and he's currently the senior political scientist. He regularly teaches classes in American politics, international relations, and political theory. In 2001, he was recognized with the prestigious award of Lincoln Land's Pearson Master Teacher Award. He's a published author and recently completed a book-length collection of letters from the First World War, which he researched and annotated. He runs the Model UN team and has been involved with the College Honors Program. So Chris and Roy, please give us a program that's going to provoke discussion and get us all thinking. Welcome. Come on up.
You get there first, right?
Thank you for that generous introduction, Kathy. If you cannot hear myself or Chris later, put your hands up so we will know. Otherwise, we cannot tell. We're very honored to be here this evening and to close off what was a wonderful year. And I would personally like to thank Kathy Johnson. I know how much work it is and how much skill it requires to get people to come to Springfield who really know their stuff, and that's what she has done, except for tonight. And you can't blame her for one night. That's just not fair. So I'd like you to think that what we're going to do tonight is we're going to look at the world order, and Chris is going to discuss that more. So how does the world work or not work? And what's happening to that fabric of understanding and behavior that's in the world at the present time? And we'll turn then to what would be a good order, what would be a good system to set up to make sure that we have a beneficial world for all the people who live on this beautiful planet. And finally, we'll end with a short piece on what the United States can do. But now, I want you to put on your imagination hats, and I know you're all very good at that. They fit very well, and you are now boarding a trawler and fishing research vessel in Taiwan. You're on the West Coast, and you're headed out into the channel with China to take temperatures of the water at various levels. And I hope you're all got your coats on because it's a little cool, but it's a beautiful morning. The sea is glassy. There's the glint of sunlight that hits some of the areas where there's some motion. And everything is peaceful and calm until we hear the sound of a larger ship, a larger motor coming, and we see it's coming right towards us. And we watch it. You're all looking at it, wondering, what is that? Because it's making a lot of noise. And then you see the Chinese red flag. And you think, oh my gosh, who brought us out onto this? What's coming on? And it's scary because the Chinese vessel is coming out at a fairly rapid pace. And it pulls right smack in front of us. And our captain turns the throttle down to 0. And we're blocked. Now, what is happening? This is signaling between two nations. One is following the rules of the International Treaty on the Oceans, which says in a narrow channel, you will get half the distance to the other country. So if the other country is 100 miles across the channel, you can go out 50 miles, and that's your territory. They're your fish that are under that water. And nobody can come into that area unless they have your permission, okay? So that's the international rule. But China, who has been the hegemon of Asia, except recently for over 2,000 years, thinks nobody's going to tell us what rules to follow. And we're the big boy in Asia, and we'll take the channel over close to the shoals of Taiwan. We'll give them 5 miles out. And otherwise, the rest of that 85 or 90 is all ours. And we're coming out to tell this pipsqueak from Philippines that you better not come out because the next time we could turn our guns loose on you. And the ship then goes away. This incident happened about 3 weeks ago. And as you all know here, incidents like this, where we have a conflict of rules when they're operating under different behaviors, can lead to a world war, as it did in the First World War. Rules do make a difference. And Chris is going to get you started tonight. Thank you.
So we're going to tag team out here. It'll start off friendly, but I think towards the end we might disagree. So we'll see. Well, we'll see. We also have very strict time limits, so I've set my clock under here going. So no clapping. So no clapping, right? No clapping, right? So the story that Roy tells us illustrates a number of things about what we're going to call the unraveling post-war rules-based order. Since the end of World War II, the mostly developed northern countries, mostly led by the United States, strove quite hard to promote cooperation and facilitate global development through a series of rules and institutions, primarily aimed at maintaining peace. That's what we're talking about as the liberal or rules-based order. That's how we're thinking about this here. So by order, what we're generally thinking of is a degree of stable predictability. And by liberal or rules-based, we're thinking that there is a broadly agreed to, if not universally accepted, framework. This is the framework which, in recent years, has come under significant strain, threatening stability, prosperity, and the example that Roy gives us has us think about the emergence of, for example, newly significant players in China, taking actions which threaten the very core of this whole system. And the core of this system, at least from 1945 onwards, was essentially a notion of sovereignty. and self-determination. Even institutions in the post-war period like the United Nations or the European Union, which potentially transcend this idea, have sovereignty at the heart of their structure. Okay? So what do we understand by sovereignty? We're talking about independent, autonomous existence, right? The fact that you can control your own future without interference from outside, without warships from somebody else telling you what to do. Okay? You're familiar with the institutions of this order. So the United Nations in general, GATT, World Trade Organization, the successor organizations to those, International Court of Justice, ICC, all of those are the core institutions, along with sort of various bi- and multi-party treaties. And here I'm thinking SALT, START, and those sorts of things. These ideas summed up by John Inkenberry, who we were talking about earlier, in 4 points, right? That this is what the system does. There is shared agreement of the rules of the game that set the order, rules and institutions that bind and limit the exercise of power, institutional autonomy from special or particular interests, and then that all of this framework is entrenched in a broader political system. So there are Inkenberry's 4 points, and it seems to us that all 4 of those are under stress. All 4 of those things are being challenged. What are some of the sources? I think the shorthand for the challenge here is interdependence. Interdependence, or perhaps what we sometimes refer to as globalization, an incredibly complex term that 20 years ago nobody had heard about, 10 years ago everybody had heard about, but nobody knew what it meant, because it's used in so many different ways that it's just different authors use it to mean different things, and it becomes very difficult to understand and get your head around what's going. Okay, so but these complex terms, I think, are actually the logical opposite of autonomous sovereignty. If you are sovereign and independent, then it's sort of the logical opposite of interdependence. And to the extent that we have an interdependent world, then there are clearly going to be challenges to sovereignty. So if we have a system based on sovereignty and there are challenges to sovereignty, the system has some problems. In simple terms, I think what we do economically, politically, socially, culturally even, seems to have evolved to a point where a system based on sovereignty is no longer suitable. It's no longer fit for task. The challenges, it doesn't meet the challenges. This isn't new. As Roy and I were discussing this, it struck me that I read a book in graduate school a long time ago, but which was written in 1971, called Sovereignty at Bay, by Vernon, who set out in 1971 the idea that transnational corporations were using the gaps within sovereignty and using the sovereignty system to their own advantage. So this is, it may be unraveling now, but this isn't new, what we're talking about. Okay, 3 challenges that we're going to look at. I'm going to look at 2 actors and 1 arena. Roy's already painted the picture, but we're going to talk about the United States, we're going to talk about China in this framework, and we're going to talk about the global commons. Okay, so there are lots of different ways we could seek to address this, but these 3 appear to us to have been raised by many of the speakers who've been here in, excuse me, in the past sessions of talk. So let's take the United States first. For decades, the United States has been the cornerstone of a rules-based liberal order, championing, not perfectly, but championing the idea of democratic values, the idea of free trade, and for a big chunk of this time, multilateralism. However, in recent years, there's been a noticeable shift in US foreign policy, marked by a more unilateralist switch, increased protectionism, and a marked skepticism towards international institutions. I think this was first articulated perhaps by the PNAC group during the Bush administration. And it sort of went into overdrive with the Trump administration, and to judge by what's being said currently, would show no signs of abating in any potential second Trump administration. So the role of the United States has changed, and we're portraying this as a retreat from global leadership and a weakening of the foundations of the post-war order. So that's the United States. On the other hand, we have China's rise as a global power, presenting both opportunities and challenges for the order. As the world's second largest economy, China has become increasingly assertive. We had speakers talk about that, and seeking to reshape the whole global structure in ways that benefit itself. Okay? As Roy's example makes clear, territorial disputes are a major part of that. Paradoxically, I think China's rise has largely been enabled by playing a free rider role in the post-war order. And there's sort of the classic free rider role of taking the benefits from the system of free trade and all of those sorts of things, but without contributing to the system in the ways that other countries have. So China's rise in both power and leadership aspirations has magnified tensions and uncertainty within the within the current order, or what we've been referring to as a quasi-order, right? I just glanced down at my clock and I'm already a minute over what I'm supposed to be. Finally, the global commons. Historically, the global commons have been defined as those parts of our planet which are outside of sovereign jurisdictions, to which all nations have access, and thus they are non-excludable and held in common. Right, sort of the collective action problem. International law generally identifies 4 global commons. These are the high seas, the atmosphere, Antarctica, and outer space. I think more broadly, the idea of commons needs to be understood to include things like the environment and natural resources more generally, including, for the first time at a really significant level, fresh potable water as a global commons, and probably, given our experiences over the last 4 or 5 years, human health as a component in this. Okay? These present a fairly unique set of challenges to the international community, which have been exacerbated by advances in technology and transformed the area in a number of different ways. Competition, conflict, and cooperation in some areas has been magnified. And newer technologies, whether it's AI, blockchain, biotechnology, have further complicated the landscape for governance, because these are so new that we don't have frameworks even to manage to deal with them. So I think perhaps what I'll do is hand back now to Roy to talk about what we might need, and then we'll take it from there. This is our key question, though. Okay, if the old world is failing, 2 things: what might we need in the new one, and where might it come from?
That was a good segue to the remarks that I will make, which have to do with, well, what is a good world order? What does it consist of? And you'll see the theme of our talk tonight is going to be related to the commons and the need to manage them. So I'll come to that in a second. But first, I want to mention, as a preface to this, the whole question of the geopolitical structure of the world right now. And the geopolitical situation has changed remarkably over the last 2 decades. And Chris talked about the rise of China. That's a major aspect of it. But China is also trying to create a Chinese-centered block of nations. They're called BRICS, B-R-I-C-S. Those are the initials for Brazil, Russia, India, South America, and China. Now, China feels that the existing world order is rotten, that it's ruled by the elites for their own benefit, and it does not serve the needs of most of the world. And so Xi Jinping's idea is to build a coalition of nations that would be suitable particularly for autocratic nations and other nations, small nations. So In terms of geopolitics, that's a big aspect because the world is splitting. It split during the Cold War and then came back together again, and then they're trying to split it. This may be temporary, or it may be for the long term. We don't know. But I would put a piece in right here that I'd like you to remember, and that is, ask yourself the question, Russia invades Ukraine, absolutely no reason for it on the international scene that says, coming out of 1945, the UN Charter, thou shalt not use force to change the borders of any nation. Thou shalt not. And that worked for almost 70 years. That's not a trivial number that I've just given you. The war, the time between the Napoleonic peace and the First World War was something like 70 years. That's a long time. And it was done through balance of power, and it was, in this period, primarily engineered by the United States, as Chris has said. So what else is going on? Well, we just mentioned the BRICS and that part, but the point I wanted to ask you is, if this invasion, not if, but when this invasion took place, what would the smaller countries of the world go? Would they side with China, which says that the invasion of the Ukraine was equally caused by, and maybe more than equally caused by, the Western nations, NATO? They forced that on Russia. And Russia, or would they take the Western side, which is what Russia has done, is broken the code of conduct of the order by what they've done, and it's immoral and absolutely beyond comprehension that they would destroy Ukraine just because they want to destroy Ukraine. And what did the smaller countries side with? Who do you think they sided with? China. Why did they decide with China? Well, that's more than we can get into tonight. It's a long question, but it's partly that they see the Western nations as elites who are used to bossing them around as colonial powers, and they're tired of it. And China says, hey, if you join us, we'll let you be part of the power structure. The West will never let you in. If you believe China is going to let anybody else make policy for them, well, I'd like to have a nice talk with you. China's in charge for 2,000 years, and except when they were down, they are the boss, and they will let you know that, as my opening incident showed. So that's geopolitics. Now I want to turn to, well, what is a good order? A good order is one that's predictable, that you can count on, and that will work. And Chris described it very well and told you about the commons. I like to take what he told you about the commons and now break those into two pieces. And those pieces is essentially the main point of our discussion tonight. Because if you can define the commons and how they should be managed, you do have a good world order, as long as you define the commons correctly. He mentioned the global commons, and rightly so, but I would also mention the regional commons. He mentioned some of the pieces like that, rivers and other things. If you're living in Cambodia and you're a fisherman on the Tonle Sap, the Great Lake that is fed every year by the floodwaters coming down the Mekong, guess what they carry? They carry rich nutrients all the way from Tibet into this lake. And it's the richest fishing area of the whole world. But what is China doing? Well, she's building 5 dams up into the Mekong, north of this upriver. And she's saying, well, the Mekong flows through my country. It's mine. I can do whatever I want with it. But that will destroy the Tonle Sap. Or what about the Nile? The Egyptians look at the Nile and say, well, that's our river. I mean, it's flowing through our country. We'll take whatever we want. And what does Ethiopia say in the Blue Nile tributary? Hey, it's flowing through our country, and we'll put up dams, and we'll take as much water as we want. So those two, and there's the Rio Grande with Mexico we could mention. Those examples show that sovereignty, as Chris so well put it, is no longer a way to organize the world. It may have worked in the 1850s, although we could all have a discussion of whether that's true, but it doesn't work now. because this is creating a situation, particularly with climate change on top of it, where countries simply will not be able to accept it. There'll be warfare when there's no more water, because that's survival. That's survival. So that's the first category of commons now. It's regional and global commons, and they're natural. And I'm going to call them natural commons because they're created by nature. Nature is our nest. That's what we live in. And nature's been very kind to us. And in the past, nature's taken a beating over the last 150 years because we've played with it and intervened with it and used it as if it was our footstool. But nature didn't fight back. Nature accepted it and did what it had to do to make do with the interventions by industrial society. But the future, that will not be true, and we already know that from climate change. Can you imagine going to Bogota, Colombia, and finding out that there's water rationing? Bogota is a beautiful place. Up in the mountains, there's water all over the place, right? But they've had a drought. It's got to do with the temperature in the Pacific right now. And they're having all kinds of trouble. Or when you go to Dubai, you read about the rainfall that came, more than a year's rainfall came in 4 hours and just flooded the whole place to pieces. Or the floods in Russia lately, which were terrible. So nature's no longer passive. You say, well, we can kick it around. Nature will take whatever we give it. And nature is saying, hey, buddy, we've taken it for quite a while, but we're now an active player. So if you look at the drivers in the world right now, as Chris said, it's China, primarily the United States, and the environment. Now that and the environment is new, not because it's new so much, but because it has to be recognized. It's there and it's active, and the climate change is a very, very good example about it. So I want to now name a second commons, and this requires you to have some imagination and think of space that is conceptual. So I'm going to say the second one are man-made commons. And Chris mentioned already, he's already hit him right on the nail. And AI is a good example. I mean, what is a commons? If you can send communications, if I could send them over to you in your country, and it would cause all your electric lights to go out, all your generators to stop. Is that a commons? Yeah, it's a commons because one country in a commons can hurt the commonality of that where many people are using it and therefore, cause trouble to all those who are dipping into that commons, whether those dippings be fish or whether they be security. So man-made commons also includes national security because you can send bombers in the air and blah, 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 blah. And cyber attacks, are those commons? Yes, they're commons because they go from one country through a common space and then cause another country to close down its hospital system, or they take a big ransom payment that comes out of it. So the two types of commons we're talking about are the man-made commons, which must be managed because a commons does not manage itself. Nobody owns it. There's no free market aspect to it. So it has to be managed by us. That's not a partisan statement. It's not a political statement. It's just a fact. Nothing else is going to make the coral reefs come back that are disappearing at a rapid pace in the ocean because we've intervened with the various things we've done. So we have to have management that will allow us to say, hey, we better not do that. Somebody's got to say that. And there's no authority in the world right now that can point to countries and say, what you're doing is going to hurt everybody. And they can just laugh and say, we don't care. We're taking care of ourselves. Opportunistic, America first kind of approach is what we need, and that's what we're going to do. Okay. So that's the good order means that there has to be a management of these two types of commons. There's no way to get around it. And Chris is going to talk to you a little bit about how that might happen. How do we rebuild a world which will allow a good life for everybody in it, even given the trespasses that we've made.
So the question is really, where might something different come from? What might it look like? Where might it come from? So I'm going to look at some questions, how might we construct a new order, or where might a new order emerge from? And we've painted a fairly dark picture. That's why we served the food beforehand, so we didn't want to put you off. But we wanted to sort of set the scene, and then this is where things might get a little more contentious, because I think Roy and I have slightly different views on where this new order might come from. The bottom line for this is, okay, things are not good. What can we do? What can we do here? And whilst Roy has provided you with lots of sort of practical questions, I'm going to try and take a slightly more theoretical approach to this, and just ask questions. Is this going to be a top-down or a bottom-up construction of the order? Is it going to be imposed from above, or is it going to well up from below, perhaps more organically, or perhaps from sort of grassroots movements? That's really what I'm going to try and talk about very quickly in this next section. On the one hand, top-down approaches entails a sort of a design and an imposition of the new order, probably utilizing existing global powers or institutions. Proponents of this sort of approach argue that a centralized, coordinated effort led by an enforcing authority is necessary to address the pressing challenges that we face today. In response, critics raise concerns about the potential for a malevolent or self-serving hegemon. We've painted China in that respect here, but I think there are big portions of the world that might paint the United States in that way. And also the likely exclusion of important voices in this process. There will also, I think, undoubtedly, or there would also, I think, undoubtedly be the practical problem of resistance to any imposed solution, because states would be unwilling, some states or some actors would be unwilling to surrender or even pool their sovereignty. In my view, a one-size-all response is unlikely to be effective. On the other hand, bottom-up approaches emphasize a sort of more organic or evolutionary approach to this global order, bottom-up, perhaps from grassroots movements, perhaps from civil society organizations, and perhaps from regional alliances. Their form will likely vary location by location and policy area by policy area, and governance will operate on different levels. It won't be just at the top level, and it will operate on different levels given different contexts. Advocates of this approach, and I think I am not revealing much by suggesting that I would count myself as one of those, argue that it would allow for greater inclusivity. It would be more diverse. It would be sensitive to the broad differences. And I think I might be willing to call these sort of moral advantages for such a system. It would therefore have greater, almost by definition, greater legitimacy in the decision-making and enforcing processes. Skeptics, and I suspect you're going to hear from one in a moment, would suggest that this efficacy and speed of bottom-up initiatives is simply not going to be sufficient, and that you require coordinated action at the international level. Perhaps we can think of this in a slightly different way then. Perhaps we can think of it as a debate between whether this potential new system will emerge organically or whether it will be consciously designed. Those who argue from a sort of evolutionary position would suggest that, look, the current system is struggling, but at core, it has the resilience and the adaptability to transform into a new order based on the existing circumstances. proponents of the designed imposed say, look, a deliberate and potentially radically different system is necessary to overcome entrenched interests, power dynamics, and the sort of institutional inertia that we see in the current system, and which to a large extent has prompted the current unraveling. And I think we need to be really clear at this point, because this is something that we wrestled with going back and forth. There are vested interests, some states, some non-state actors, both legal and extra-legal, and here I'm thinking of transnational organized crime and illegal economies, for example, institutions which thrive in the gaps in the current system, which exploit the weaknesses of the current system, and have no interest in resolving the current system, because they have developed to exploit that system, whether this is transnational corporations or whether it's multinational or whether it's rogue states who pit countries against other countries. In this respect, one of the questions that was asked by the students ahead of time, I think, really is useful for us, and this is the sort of temporal question, the question of time. Many of the international actors that we deal with tend to work on very short time horizons, whether that's the quarterly report, their financial report of their corporations, or whether it's the election cycle. Whilst others, and these have been typically people from the sort of environmental point of view and the threat to global commons, have thought in longer term. In this respect, I think the situation we find ourselves in now and the threat to the global commons and the impending environmental crisis might change those calculations by simultaneously shortening the time span that some people have taken and making the threat immediate for people who've taken only a short-term view of this sort of thing. So if we talk about things like points of no return, tipping points, and all of that, that adds a time-critical dimension to what we're talking about. And if radical environmental collapse is now a short-term proposition, it might, sort of like a death sentence, concentrate the mind, right? In the sense that if it's right there, we have to deal with it. And the emerging system, what Richard Haas has referred to as World Order 2.0, might well be a complex mix of above and below. And so we're going to sort of caricature it like that. Is it going to come from below or is it going to come from above? And Roy, I think, is going to hand us the first of those views.
Before I explain to you why Chris is wrong, I want to just mention two possibilities of how the world order could eventuate. One, there could be a world hegemon. Now, that's not one that we've ever talked very much about, but when you consider the way the technology has gone right now in terms of surveillance technology and AI and others, it's conceivable that if things go into chaos to a great degree, some power will come up and essentially take over the world. And you and I would not like to be in that world because it will be a very autocratic world. Well, what's another possibility that's very likely to happen, which would probably be temporary, is that the world breaks into blocks. This is what happened during the Depression. The system kind of came to a halt in terms of really working as an international system. And like baby chicks, the very small countries all looked for some mother hen around that they could reside under her wings and get protection from what was a chaotic world. So you got dollar areas, South America, you got sterling areas, British Empire, and you got Chinese, and you got Japanese areas, particularly in the Asia. That could happen, but it's unlikely that will last very long because it will mean that there is no international trade that's dependable. In other words, the rules will all be up in the air, and it will be not just America first, but it would be my region first, and then people would use their power. So underneath the surface of what we're talking about tonight, we're really saying the world is going to have a choice between a set of rules that are based on everybody agreeing on how to behave, that's a rule-based world order, or a power-based world order. And although we can't get into it tonight, I would argue that the United States is moving toward a power-based system, and China is adamant that that's what it should be. So those are two things, and before I come back again, Chris is going to talk a little bit about, well, how are some of the bottom-up systems possible?
So he let me off. All right, let's see if I can do this really quickly. So where might we look for a solution if it's not top down? Well, building a new global order is going to require a delicate balance between some centralized coordination and what's going to be vital, I think, is decentralized participation. We're going to need continuity of some elements and innovation. Change is really difficult, and any emergent system is going to necessitate active engagement of diverse players, including states, powerful and less powerful, and non-state actors, and international and transnational organizations in shaping the contours of the future world. The processes for achieving this aren't clear. We don't have answers to this, but what is clear is there needs to be very broad buy-in to such a system, and as a result, the costs of entry need to be low. Otherwise, people won't play, won't get buy-in. There won't be buy-in to the system. Go back to something we talked about earlier. Previously, sovereignty has been conceptualized negatively, not as a bad thing, but negatively as in, liberal negative rights. Leave me alone. Freedoms from. I am sovereign. I am autonomous in that that I'm able to control what I'm doing and nobody else messes with me. What's interesting is one person I've mentioned earlier, Richard Haas, has to some extent reversed that idea in terms of a potential change in the international system, where he's taken the idea of sovereignty and coupled it with the idea of sovereign obligations, right? That along with sovereignty is not just don't mess with me, I choose, but sovereignty is a basic set of obligations which all entities which claim to be sovereign have to adopt. This is the base of his World Order 2.0 writings. And he lists them. So really quickly, an agreed basis for statehood, something which, for example, might be crucial in understanding the current situation in the Middle East, right? That states identify an agreed basis for statehood. A rejection of terrorism, see above. Rejection of the use of nuclear weapons, a commitment to cooperative climate change, and in this it would include global health, and a commitment to trade agreements. The idea is that if you can provide a basic framework of very high-level agreements, these sovereign obligations, then you don't speak to particular policy outcomes, but you set up the arena in which the policy outcomes are to be decided. The trouble with this is he spelled out these ideas in the 2010s, he articulated them in 2017, and what we might suggest is that 7 years on with no potential movement in these directions, it's simply too late to look at these sorts of things. A related but distinct approach, which I find fairly interesting, and I would encourage people who are interested in this to look at it, has been put forward by Danny Roderick and Stephen Walt of the Harvard Kennedy School. And they've talked about an international meta-regime as a basis for a new world order. And they set out 4 basic conditions. What is it that we want from the order? What counts as working? And, the starkness of these is quite important to me. Number 1, and this goes to the discussion we had earlier, preserving conditions for sustained human existence. I mean, that's a big one, right? That seems to me that's fairly significant. Second, minimizing the risk of war. Third, managing the movement of goods, capital, information, and people. And I'm taking that to be equatable with this global commons that we've identified. And 4, respect for human rights. Okay, so these are all big, nice, fuzzy-sounding things, but I think what they're getting at is that in most understandings of international regimes, we think of them as convergences of actors' expectations. They're agreed rules where actors' expectations converge. And so I think really what Roderick and Walt are arguing when they talk about a meta-regime is a minimum set of agreements that everybody, all of the actors need to settle around, because that will set the framework, the context in which any arguments, any debates, any negotiations will take place. So we can't, it's fruitless for us to talk about what we should do at this point. What we need to talk about is how we are going to consider what we should do, right? So the context in which we make our decisions rather than what the decisions will be, that we sort of agree to the rules of the game. So they've written, there's a Harvard white paper on this, and there is a Foreign Affairs article on this. I would really suggest that you have a look at those. It's very nuanced, very sophisticated, but I think if I'm going to simplify it, what they're suggesting is the key focus that we need to have is on process, right? Where actions and objections of various actors, including states, be explained publicly and clearly, and all of the bargaining that goes on. And they're not shying away from the fact that there is going to be a lot of bargaining in this process, has to be done in good faith, and the best way to keep that in good faith is to be as transparent as possible. And so all of their framework is based on that. So it seems to me that we cannot, at this stage, determine what policy outcomes will be. We don't know the solutions, but what we can do, so we don't know what we can do, but what we can do, what we must do, is agree on the processes by how we come to the solutions. And my bet is that this is going to require a flexible, multi-level approach to it, rather than anything top-down. And now Roy will tell you why I'm wrong.
You know, Chris, I would never do that. It's nice to think that a democratic approach is the right approach to international governance, but it is not. We've tried it. We've tried climate change for 30 years. The conference in Rio was in something like 1996. That's 30 years ago almost. And it was, hey, you all come, join us. We're going to push the carbon emissions down, right? And that's our objective. And 30 years later, which direction are carbon emissions going? Up. They're still climbing. And the reason for that is that you set an obligation, you don't set any obligation for membership. You make easy membership because you want a broad view. Well, they got 190 countries in the IPCC. That's pretty good. Good for what if they don't do anything? And it's so easy to be an easy writer. It's so easy to say, oh, I'm going to join, and now I'm a member of this, and we've got inclusivity, and we've got diversity and the things that Chris mentioned. But what are they worth if the planet is not being managed in a way that people can live in it? It's not worth anything. We've got to have a tough-minded approach to this. We've played the other game for 30 or 40 years. If we would have started dealing with the reality of the commons in 1990, we'd be a long ways away from being successful. We would be way along being successful, rather. But we didn't do that. We just played games and we let the vested interests determine our future, which is not a very smart move. So I'm going to pour cold water on Chris, much as I admire him and his ideas, because that kind of easy entry to get democratic inclusivity is a trap. And we've tried it. The UN did it. Said, you want to join the General Assembly in 1945? What do you have to do? What do you have to promise? And what's the answer? Nothing. All you had to do is say, hey, I want to join. Do you have to be a state? Do you have to be able to keep terrorists out? Do you have to be a capable government to join it and take responsibilities? No. And so you can join, and you're a member of the General Assembly, and you get to vote, 1 vote per country. And what does that give you? Nothing. It's a useless body. It has symbolic importance, and that's all. Same way with climate change. They all joined, but every year they make excuses that they can't do it. What does this lead? It leads to the fact that our world, if we're going to be realistic about it, requires some really hard work to get things right in the commons that I mentioned before. It's not just going to happen and not hurt anybody. It'll be hard. Be like we went through the Second World War. We all had rationing, sea rations. We had this rations. We had that rations. Did anybody complain? No, because the enemy was evident. Is the enemy evident now? Well, to some people, but not to the others. And so they let things go the way they're going. Let me mention the German plan of last year, something that we had worked on here in the group that I work with. And that was the Carbon Club. And the Carbon Club is based on a psychological principle. It says that if you get a large group together and ask them to take on tough tasks, they'll all say yes but do nothing. That's a free rider, right? But if you get a small band of countries together and you say, look, this is what we have to do. Let's say it's about coral reefs, or let's say it's about the oceans and the plastic mess in there. And these countries, it doesn't matter really who they are, but they have to be fairly sophisticated. You might get New Zealand, and you might get Holland, and you might get others, and say, you come together and you're determined to deal with this. You then set the standards for that. You set the norms, the regulations that would give you some success on whatever that is. The Germans said it's on carbon emissions because that's the most crucial problem facing the world as far as they were concerned. So you get together what might be called a band of brothers. They all come together. They're sworn to each other. There may be only 8 of them or maybe 6. But they set high standards, standards that will make a difference because they're really going to dig into it. And as they do that, and as they show that that works, that the oceans are getting better and the coral reefs are coming back, or whatever it might be, they will then entice other countries to join. They will be as seductive as they can to get countries to say, look, you're out there, you're not doing anything for this. We have a way of doing it. Join us. It's tough, but you'll take pride in the fact that you are doing the world's work. So I call that an enticement model. It deals with the problems that Chris talked about, but it deals with them from the top down. Why does it have to be the top down? Because what we have to do is tough. Nobody can convince me that a committee can run a tough organization. We've all been involved in committees. There may be one strong person, and that'll make the thing go. But having 100 countries together in a room and they're going to make a decision, laughable, just laughable. So there has to be a small group. The German idea is, I think, a very good idea. We also have to deal with time. We don't have much time. So the idea that you start from where you are, that's what this is. And you say, okay, how many countries want to join us in a carbon club? And you get 6 or 8. Then you really got something. Then you can say, well, that's okay theoretically, Roy, but the different countries are not going to do that. The United States is going toward isolationism now, barely giving support to Ukraine, who's fighting our war. And you can't depend on any constant policy. So there can't be these things. That's just a joke. Because if the government changes and then takes it and uses this great program and they say, well, we don't back that anymore, we're done with that. it won't work. But we have to assume that as things get worse, governments will get more stable. They'll be more willing to take on, and then Chris just described that before, the hard tasks and stick to it. And the public will back that. That's going to depend on the public, whether they will be constant, because we had an ardor that worked during the Cold War. You say, well, yeah, it was scary as hell. Well, yeah, it was, but it worked. As long as the two major powers could find ways to keep things going, the rest of the world worked very well. I mean, there was enormous economic progress, decolonization of the whole world. It had all kinds of good pieces to it. So that could be the case in the future if we get something that really works and we build on it and you get the public support for what it is. So I see that this may not be the right way to do it, but it's got to come from the top. There's got to be experts at the top. They've got to decide what would make this thing work. What do you do with AI? Well, there's an AI institute now all over the world on how to deal with AI. What are the guardrails? And I just learned the other day that in that institute and in their work, there's not one country that has included military operations in that. Now think of that. You're controlling AI, and the countries are doing it, and you don't bring any military operations in. And there are AI systems for battlefield control now that are AI already, but there's no guardrails for it, and they were used a lot by the Israelis in Gaza, and they were controlling a lot of where the targets went. And the drone going in was guided by, well, there might be a Hamas target there. There are also 50 civilian people there. Well, it doesn't know anything about that or care. That's how dangerous it is to make autonomous weapons which are not under any control. So that's just emphasizing, again, that we have to have management from the top. And Chris can now tell you the truth.
Right. Okay, so actually I don't disagree entirely with that. I think the key is going to be a variety of different approaches for a variety of different problems in a variety of different locations. I think I would query, respectfully, some of the statements about the success during the Cold War, and I think we could probably line up quite a lot of countries who didn't think that the process of decolonization was successful, or that there was a real attempt at buy-in at the United Nations, or those sorts of things. But looking at sort of potential future situation, I think we know about the hegemon's dilemma. And the idea that if we have a top-down system by a small number, at some point that small number is going to be putting more and more resources into maintaining the system and not getting the payoff from the system, and then they're going to walk away, much like the United States is doing now, I think. I think an imposed system won't have buy-in, and I think that's perhaps part of the problem that the United Nations thought. And I think that the actors capable of making the imposition currently are showing very little interest in doing so. And so that, for me, is perhaps fatal to the situation. And there are actors who would challenge your statement about, and here I think you're right, about the necessity of expertise and science, but expertise and science is not, I think, the deity that it once was in terms of guiding our choices. So I wouldn't want to portray my view as particularly idealistic. I mean, I think Roderick, an economist, right? Roderick is going to say, hey, there's really tough, complex bargaining going on here, but what is absolutely necessary is a flexible system, and any imposed system is likely to be inflexible and therefore overly rigid and potentially only short-lived. Now, I did like what you said. My background is in the European Union, and listening to you talking about expertise in a small group and encouraging other people in, I think that that's, for me, functionalism, like David Matrani's functionalism, and the whole idea that we take a technical problem, and if we succeed on this technical problem, people will become interested in joining because it works. Nothing succeeds like success. I think that's true, but I think the problem that the functionalists always ran into was when you moved outside of technical areas into political areas where the solutions were more contested than that. So I think I'll respectfully disagree and hand it back to you to...
You handed it. We're going to close almost right away, but I want to say that this guy that to my right here is a really fine thinker in international relations. And it's been a privilege for me to work with him, and we've had a good time in building this. So what is the bottom line of what we're saying tonight? The bottom line is it's one world. Do any of you remember Wendell Willkie and his book One World in 1939? Well, that's what he said. And we don't recognize that. It is one world. And I've been blessed to go around a good bit of this world and meet people, the leaders and the people in many countries, and live in some of them, and they're wonderful people. But there is no vision. There's no statecraft. We were really deficient in creating statecraft and leaders who have a vision. So I'd like to close on a positive note, and then I'm going to turn it over to Chris for the final word. And that is that if you have a visionary leader who can touch people's hearts and can say, this is the way we're going to go, and really know what he's talking about, and not just be a man on a white horse that blabbers, then we have a chance to do something. Because it's almost impossible to realize what our country did during the Second World War, and I remember that so clearly. There was all kinds of movements not to go out into the world. Look what we did. We made a mistake in the First World War. I ain't do that again, right? But then when Pearl Harbor came, whoops, everybody was together, and we accomplished an enormous amount of things. We were not enormous, but incredible things. But that was because there was a steady leadership, there was hope. Hope is terribly important in political life. You don't put that into any mathematical formula, but it is. So if we can get some visionary leaders, and I look to our students tonight to all become visionary leaders, because we need you. We need people who've got the gumption to stand up and say, this is what we can do, and this is what we must do. And there's no limit to what's possible if we do that. And I turn now to Chris for the final amen tonight.
I'm really just going to reiterate what Roy said. The construction of a new global order is complicated, multifaceted. It's going to need all sorts of consideration. But whether it's top-down or bottom-up, organic, evolutionary, deliberative design, the key does, I think, lie in fostering collaboration, dialogue, and cooperation, because the bargaining is going to be difficult. If we can have an agreed framework, an arena in which that is going to take place, then I think that's absolutely vital for negotiating the challenges of the 21st century. And now I'm going to go off script because a student this evening asked a question about lessons and moving forward. And I think this half of the room probably owes that table something of an apology, in the sense that it was our generations that have got us here, but we're depending on them to fix it.
mic and it's up here. Can you hear me okay? Nope. All right.
Do you want to stand in the middle?
Okay. We've got time for questions, and I would encourage you to raise your hand and then say if your question is for Roy or for Chris or for both. Okay? Sir? And I'll repeat the question so everybody can hear it. Okay. So George is asking us to remember World War I, World War II, the Korean War, and the economic development afterwards. He cited in particular Germany and Italy and made the point that money talks, that those developed economies are working. So Roy, do you want to comment on that?
Well, we often talked about how you can't do nation building, and we shouldn't try. Well, that's largely true in countries that don't have any basis for it. But the lesson that came out of this that George was referring to was Japan and Germany were rebuilt under completely different norms, and the United States essentially did it through the Marshall Plan, which was a brilliant idea. I mean, it just illustrates the point I was making earlier. With good ideas and good people, we can do all kinds of things. And the success of a lot of the European countries is related to the fact that they look back on 150 years of nationalism, which didn't turn out very well, and they made a commitment. Jean Monnet in France was one of the leaders of it, that they were not going to do that. That's gone. That's on. We tried that. That didn't work. And they came together in a European Union. So those are all wonderful examples of how we can learn from what's happened. Now, Chris, you want to add anything to that?
Okay, next question. Yes. Yep, that was, she's referencing a quote on a sheet of paper on the table that talks about percentages of people that are interested in maintaining the current rules and ways of doing things. And she's also referencing the rise in tension, and particularly on university campuses right now, and asking for a comment on what is going to come next. Is that going to continue? Chris, you want to do that?
Okay, so it's, again, an incredibly complicated question and right on point, hitting the, like, everything. So, first of all, I see protests on campuses, regardless of the particular issue, as a positive thing, right? In the sense that we have a much maligned group, generation of people who are often pointed to as being lazy or disinterested or uncaring or absorbed in their phones or whatever the particular trope is. I think that people are, that we have clearly vigorous interest in the situation in Palestine, the situation in a number of other countries as a positive thing for engagement. I mean, so that's a first comment. I think it's unsettling, but I think if the existing order is unfair, unrepresentative, and not working, then perhaps it needs to be unsettled, right? So that's a sort of a general comment there. Prognostication, I'm not very good at. Graduating in 1998 as an expert in, 1988 as an expert in the Cold War, just as the Soviet Union collapsed, is an indicator that I'm not very good at that. Where are we going? I don't know. But look, if people are, there are different ways. So the people don't want to maintain the system. Right? Okay. There could be two reasons for that. And one of the reasons for that would be one I would share. If the system isn't working, if the system is overly privileging certain groups, if the system is incapable of dealing with the environmental crisis, then I don't want to preserve that. I'm part of that group who don't want to preserve that system. However, we do need to think about, and this was sort of the point of what we were trying to say, or at least provoke, we do need to think about what might replace it. Or like if the old is swept away, what is the new order? And that's scary. That is scary. But I think for significant portions of the global population, the existence of the last 50, 100 years has been fairly scary. We have had food security, we have had shelter, we have had, as Roy pointed out, 70 years of peace in the developed northern world. That hasn't been the case in big sections of the rest of the world. And so, I think we do need to think about where we're going and what our role in. But if we are capable, and I share Roy's optimism because I look at people like you, that there is hope and that we are capable of generating a new system. Is it going to be easy? No, absolutely not. It just isn't. Is there going to be hard work? Is there going to be hard bargaining? Are we going to make mistakes? Absolutely. But the bottom line is we don't have any option, I think. We have to move towards something different.
I'm going to take my prerogative and answer a little bit of that question myself, if I may. I wanted to pick up on the idea that she said about the young people. Look at some of the recent movements, whether it's coming out of Tiananmen Square in China or Tahrir Square in Egypt or the Arab Spring. Young people have played pivotal roles over and over and over again in our history to get attention, to get issues moving, to capture the ear of decision makers and policy leaders. And sometimes that's done peacefully, sometimes it's not. That's a whole different question, but I agree with what Chris said, that it's a positive. The young people really do have a role to play. And I'm going to disagree with Roy on one thing. Sorry, Roy. When Roy talked about the absence of statecraft, I feel privileged that over my career I've seen incredibly brilliant examples of statecraft and people who step up to the plate and achieve great things, sometimes from positions that come from nowhere. Now, a lot of times it's short-lived, but then other people step up to build on that. And it might be an isolated diplomat, it might be a world leader. Look at the leader of Ukraine right now. He was a comedian, and look how he's rallied his country. So I think the human spirit and the optimism that both Roy and Chris talked about has ways of shining through and triumphing, even under times of tension. And boy, do I have faith in the youth all around the world. They have so much potential. Okay, I'll give the mic back now. Next question.
In the back there.
Yes. Okay, that was really complex, Rich. I'll see if I can do a decent job of summarizing that. So given the unraveling of the world order, and given the two bad actors that we see currently on the world stage, and taking into account natural resources, things like minerals and water, and taking into account that people like to be associated with a winner, what comes next?
I got an answer to that one. I think we could argue about the details here, but we're in the crisis. The crisis is here. It's whether we recognize it or not, right? And the big difference is that this is a truly existential crisis that for very large numbers of the global population, this is, including within the United States, where that water that's protected us might be lapping at Miami much more closely in the next few years. So I think sort of agree with the premise that it's going to take a crisis. In fact, that's sort of what underpins what I'm saying, that crisis is here and now, and we're in it, and therefore we need to be responding to it now. The winners and losers in this situation, when you have global climate change, when you have rising sea levels, when you have all of the other things that we could talk about, then I think that does concentrate the mind that that I want to hope that we can begin to think of this as humanity rather than as Russians or Chinese or Americans or Brits or whatever. So I mean, I think that's the universalizing idea of crisis that really underpinning what I'm saying, that we're in that crisis. Pearl Harbor's happened, if you want to use that analogy.
Except you did state it has to be recognized.
And I think the people I think a very large number of people outside of the positions of power are recognizing it. That's why you're seeing more popular movements, where you're seeing more grassroots movements. I mean, I think there is a broad recognition in large numbers of people, but I take your point that there are very strong vested interests who have a vested interest in not recognizing it.
That being said, do you believe that the countries of Africa understand it?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
But they're at war with it.
They're at war with...
Well, there are several conflicts going on in Africa.
Oh, they're at war with each other, for sure. But I'm not sure why that challenge... I mean, do they understand climate change? Do they understand that the global system has put them in a disadvantageous position? Absolutely. I mean, yes. And many of those conflicts that you're talking about are precipitated or involving, whether it's the Wagner Group or whether it's US multinationals or people taking resources, right? So I think they absolutely understand the situation. And some of the mass migration issues that we're facing and some of the instability is an attempt of people who are desperate to deal with that.
Okay. I'll close out then with a question that I was asked as I was walking in earlier, which is tonight's presentation going to focus solely on what governments are doing to one another? What about individuals? And what about nonprofits and the business community? Where do they fit in all this?
Well, that's a wonderful question, and you won't get a wonderful answer from me. In some sense, the big multinational corporations are running the world. I mean, there's a certain truth in that, and there's no country that really stands up against it. For a while, we thought the United States was going to have maybe a situation where the big tech companies and stuff were going to be broken up under the antitrust. But the more the things have gone on, it's just going the other direction. Now, when they look at the international situation, they say, well, we need all this. We need all these big companies because China's going to take us down. Well, I just end and say that it's not clear that China's going to take us down. And I think we've come through that, and I'm glad to see that, because China's got as many problems and many more than we have. The great advantage of the United States, and don't ever forget this, is that we attract talent from all over the world. China attracts talent from no place because the Han civilization does not accept it. That's an enormous advantage. And Xi Jinping is not only an autocratic leader, but he's a very fragile leader. He's unsure of himself. He's not the smartest guy on the block by a long shot. And so he's run into the power paradox, which is the higher up you get with power, the more you're worried that somebody's going to unseat you, unhorse you. And Xi Jinping is very worried about that. He's cracked down with the Communist Party, and he's not running the economy very well, but he's also dealing with a legacy of past Chinese mistakes that have been covered up. So that doesn't really answer your question, but that's what I'm going to say.
All right, Chris, do you have anything?
Yeah. So the question, I like the question because I think that non-state actors and the failure of the system and the failure of analysts, political science, for example, to consider the role of non-state actors is a major failing. And I think any future new system will have to take more looks at whether they are NGOs, standard sorts of NGOs, non-governmental organizations, or whether it is individual level operations. I think ideas like global civil society, the emergence of a global civil society, I think I'm somewhat of a technophobe, and so we tend to focus on the threats of new communications technologies and all of those. But one of the things we have to remember is that it's the sort of virtual communications and such has enabled virtual communities of interest. I mean, it hasn't just enabled multinational corporations and Microsoft, but it's enabled very much grassroots level organizations of civil society. And absolutely, those are going to be crucial in terms of responding to many of the challenges that we've got. And many of the ideas and many of the innovations are going to come from that framework rather than the broader framework. So, I mean, I absolutely agree with the spirit of the question. We have failed, but we've had an entirely state-centric system for much of the period. We've begun to realize that there are other actors. We now actually need to build those other actors into the system and give them access, give them buy-in.
And that's true.
Okay, thank you. Well, I have two things left to do this evening. The first is to thank our speakers and then to offer I'll offer following that just a few closing remarks. So, boy, you guys, you gave us a lot to think about tonight. Lots of really complex challenges for us to consider.
Well, you told us to provoke, so.
I did. I acknowledge that. But you did a great job. And thank you for coming. Thank you for sharing your expertise, your time, your talents with us. And thank you to the young ambassadors for coming tonight. It's always a real pleasure to have you guys. And so I would like to present Dr. Worley and Dr. Chris McDonald, forgot his last name, with books that we're able to give to our speakers courtesy of the Abraham Lincoln Foundation. So thanks to them. They will each receive a copy of Leadership in Our Current Times, signed by the author Doris Kearns Goodwin. So, Chris?